The Redwood Rest Stop, a quiet oasis on a lonely stretch of highway, was about to become the stage for something unexpected. When Jack Thompson, a seasoned Marine veteran, stopped for a cup of coffee, he had no idea that he was about to face an entirely different kind of battle. As he observed a young black girl and an older white man sitting together, Jack's finely tuned instincts immediately signaled that something was terribly wrong. But in a world where appearances can be deceiving, how could Jack be sure? And what hidden danger might be lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary scene? Jack Thompson had spent years in the military, trained to notice details others would overlook. His instincts had kept him alive in combat, and even now, years later, they still guided him. Today, he was just a traveler on a long journey, seeking a brief respite from the endless stretch of road. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and red, as Jack pulled into the quiet rest stop. Stepping out of his vehicle, he stretched, taking in the crisp evening air. The highway was nearly empty, save for a few parked cars. The scent of fresh coffee wafted from a small roadside diner, inviting him in. The establishment was simple, with a handful of tables and chairs, a counter lined with coffee mugs, and an old jukebox humming softly in the corner. As Jack approached the counter, ready to order his usual black coffee, his attention was drawn to a table by the window. A middle-aged white man sat there, dressed in a well-tailored navy blue suit. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, and he held a newspaper in his hands, though he didn't appear to be reading it. Across from him sat a young black girl, no older than 8, wearing a light blue dress. She was quiet, her small hands nervously twisting in her lap, her large eyes filled with unease. Jack felt a prickling at the back of his neck. Something about the scene unsettled him. The man exuded an air of control, his glances toward the girl calculated and deliberate. Meanwhile, the girl appeared tense, her gaze darting around the diner, never settling on one spot for long. Every time she moved, even slightly, the man's eyes followed her. It was subtle, but Jack caught it. As a Marine, Jack had been trained to assess threats quickly and efficiently. He had learned that danger often hid in plain sight, masked by normalcy. Was this man the girl's father? A relative? Or was something more sinister at play? Jack sipped his coffee, positioning himself near the vending machines where he could observe without drawing attention. The girl's behavior only heightened his suspicions. Her posture was rigid, her hands clenched together in her lap. Occasionally, she would glance toward the door, her expression unreadable but tinged with something that looked like fear. The man, in contrast, remained calm, almost too calm. He flipped through his newspaper, took slow sips of coffee, and seemed entirely at ease. But Jack could see the way he monitored the girl's every movement. Jack's military training had taught him that the smallest details often held the most crucial clues. He began noting everything, the girl's fidgeting, the man's careful control, the way she never quite met his gaze. He had seen fear before, raw, unfiltered fear, and he was seeing it now in the girl's eyes. A memory surfaced in Jack's mind. He recalled a mission overseas, a tense operation where a single misread signal could mean life or death. He had learned to trust his instincts, and those instincts were screaming at him now. Something wasn't right. He decided to test the situation. Slowly, he walked past the table, pretending to browse the selection at a nearby vending machine. As he passed, he saw the girl's small hand move. It was brief, barely noticeable, but Jack caught it. She raised her hand slightly, fingers spread wide, palm outward. It was a subtle yet unmistakable gesture, one he recognized from his military days. It was a distress signal. Jack's pulse quickened. The girl wasn't just uncomfortable, she was asking for help. This was no ordinary father-daughter moment. The fear in her eyes, the controlled vigilance of the man, and now the silent plea for help. It all added up. He had to act, but he needed to be smart about it. If the man was truly dangerous, a direct confrontation could put the girl at even greater risk. Jack quickly considered his options. Calling the authorities was one, but that could take time. He needed to confirm the situation before making a move. Casually, he approached the counter again, ordering a refill. As he waited, he turned to the waitress. "That girl over there, she seems a little nervous. You know her?" he asked in a low voice. The waitress glanced toward the table and frowned. "Never seen her before, but now that you mention it, she does seem a bit uneasy. The guy with her checked in about 20 minutes ago, Didn't order much, just coffee. Jack nodded, his mind racing. He needed a way to separate the girl from the man without raising suspicion. He turned back to the table, his mind formulating a plan. The girl still avoided eye contact, but her hands continued their nervous movements. Jack decided to act. Approaching the table, he put on a friendly smile. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing the man. "I couldn't help but notice you and your daughter here. My niece is about the same age, always restless on road trips, you guys traveling far." The man's expression remained composed, but Jack noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps. "Just passing through," he said smoothly. "We'll be back on the road soon." Jack turned his attention to the girl, giving her a warm, reassuring smile. "Hey there, sweetheart, you doing okay?" The girl hesitated, glancing quickly at the man before nodding slightly. Jack caught the hesitation, the way her fingers tightened around the hem of her dress. He decided to push a little further. "You know, the vending machine over there has some pretty good snacks. My treat, what do you say?" The girl's eyes widened slightly, as if weighing her options. The man stiffened but maintained his polite facade. "That's not necessary," he said, his voice edged with something harder now. "We're fine." Jack didn't back down. "Come on, everyone loves a good snack on the road. What do you say, kiddo?" The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second longer before nodding. Jack extended his hand, offering her the chance to take it. She didn't move immediately, but then, in a swift, almost desperate motion, she reached out and grasped his fingers. The man stood abruptly. "I think we should be going," he said sharply, but Jack had already positioned himself between him and the girl. "I don't think so," Jack said firmly. "I think we're going to have a little chat first." The diner's atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, eyes turned toward them. The waitress picked up the phone, likely calling the authorities. Jack kept his stance firm, shielding the girl while keeping the man in his line of sight. He had seen enough. His instincts had been right. And now he was ready to make sure that whatever danger this girl was in, Jack had suspected something was off all along, but now he was certain. The girl's eyes were filled with desperation, pleading for help without uttering a word. She couldn't scream or directly call for assistance, but that brief glance conveyed everything. Her fear, her helplessness, it was the look of someone trapped with no escape. No ordinary child would wear such an expression. Jack's instincts sharpened, honed from years in the military, every battle-hardened moment rushing back to him. This was no longer just a gut feeling. This was a silent cry for rescue. He needed to act, but he had to be careful. If he confronted the man without a strategy, things could spiral out of control, putting the girl at even greater risk. But walking away wasn't an option. Time was running out, and Jack couldn't afford to hesitate. His sharp gaze swept across the diner, taking stock of the other patrons, some eating, some lost in their own worlds. None seemed aware of the quiet crisis unfolding. The late afternoon ambience remained undisturbed, yet the tension Jack felt was nearly suffocating. He wished he had already called the police, but it wasn't too late. The girl's small hand trembled as she subtly raised it again. Her fingers spread wide, a deliberate gesture. Jack's heart pounded. It was a universal sign of distress, one he had seen in countless emergencies. This was real. He could no longer stand idly by. Without drawing attention, he retrieved his phone and strode toward the diner's exit, his fingers moving swiftly as he dialed. 911, what's your emergency? Jack kept his voice low, urgent, but steady. I'm at a rest stop diner on the Redwood Highway. I think I'm witnessing a kidnapping. There's a black girl about 8 years old in a light blue dress sitting with a middle-aged white man. She's signaling for help. He relayed every critical detail, highlighting the girl's distress signals and the unnatural control the man seemed to exert over her. He hesitated for only a second before adding, I'm a former Marine. I believe she's in real danger. We can't afford to wait. The operator reassured him. Officers are en route. Stay calm and don't engage. They'll be there shortly. Jack exhaled slowly, tension coiling tight in his chest. The authorities were on their way, but every second felt unbearably long. He turned back to the diner, positioning himself near the entrance to maintain a watchful eye without arousing suspicion. Inside, the girl's demeanor confirmed everything. She sat unnaturally still, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't glancing around anymore. Instead, she fixated on the empty space before her, as though willing herself invisible. Jack's gaze flickered to the man. He appeared calm, too calm. He turned pages of a newspaper absently, but every so often he cast a sharp, scrutinizing glance at the girl. It wasn't the look of a guardian. It was the gaze of a captor. Jack clenched his jaw. He couldn't wait for the police. He had to act now. He stood deliberately composed and walked toward the table. The man looked up, his expression shifting from disinterest to thinly veiled wariness. Jack forced a casual smile, but his body remained coiled, ready to strike if necessary. "Evening," he greeted, his voice steady but probing. "Everything all right here?" The man arched a brow, clearly caught off guard. Then a slow, forced smile curled his lips. "Yes, we're just taking a break from a long trip," he answered smoothly. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his focus to the girl, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his tone soft but filled with quiet urgency. The girl hesitated. Her wide eyes flicked toward the man before darting back to Jack. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she gave a small, rigid nod. It was unnatural, forced. Jack's pulse hammered. Every detail, the stiffness in her movements, the silence, the fear, solidified his worst suspicions. The man's smile remained intact, but his eyes hardened. "She's fine," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "Just shy around strangers." Jack didn't break eye contact with the girl. He could see it, the desperate plea hidden behind that forced nod. She was terrified. Trapped. He needed to tread carefully. If he pushed too hard, the man might panic and do something drastic. But Jack couldn't afford to let him walk out with her. The police were on their way, but that meant nothing if the man decided to flee. Jack straightened, giving the girl one last reassuring look before stepping back. "Glad to hear it," he said, his tone measured. Then he turned toward the counter, his body positioned to keep the pair in his periphery. The man's voice followed him, unnaturally bright. "Thanks for checking in. Have a good evening." Jack didn't reply. He couldn't risk giving anything away. Instead, he positioned himself near the entrance, his mind racing. He had to keep the girl in sight until the authorities arrived. If the man so much as shifted toward the door, Jack would block his path. Minutes passed like hours. Jack's muscles remained taut, his every sense attuned to the girl's safety. The air in the diner felt thick with unspoken tension. The man had resumed his newspaper act, but Jack noticed his movements were less fluid, his fingers tightening slightly around the pages. He was growing wary. Suspicious. Then Jack heard it, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the evening air. Relief surged through him, but he didn't let his guard down. The man stiffened, his fingers stilling over the newspaper. His eyes flickered toward the window, his body subtly tensing. Jack braced himself. If the man decided to make a break for it, he'd be ready. The sirens grew louder, flashing lights reflecting against the diner's glass. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Jack took a slow step forward, his stance firm, ready to act at the slightest sign of resistance. The girl's fate depended on it. And Jack wouldn't fail her now. Jack understood with absolute certainty that he needed to prevent the man from leaving. His mind raced through possibilities, scenarios forming and unraveling in rapid succession as he calculated his next move. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm, his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to tip the man off. If he so much as suspected Jack's intentions, he might act rashly, and that was the last thing Jack wanted. The stakes were too high. Then, just as his thoughts reached a fever pitch, Jack caught another small movement from the girl. This time, she raised her hand as if to brush her hair back. It was subtle, seemingly natural, but Jack's sharp eyes caught the familiar pattern. Her palm was open, her fingers deliberately spread apart. She was repeating the distress signal. The silent cry for help. This was no coincidence. Jack's stomach tightened. His hand moved instinctively, slipping into the pocket of his jacket where his phone was. He kept his movements casual, his gaze flicking away just for a second to avoid drawing attention as he unlocked his phone and quickly dialed 911 again. He pressed the device to his ear, his voice low but urgent, his tone carrying an undeniable sense of determination. "Hello, I'm the person who called earlier about a suspicious situation at the Redwood Highway rest stop," he said, trying to maintain a steady voice. "I'm still here. The girl is signaling for help again. I'm certain of it. I need officers here now. This man could be dangerous." The dispatcher remained calm and professional, reassuring Jack that officers were already en route. "They're minutes away," she informed him. "Please remain where you are and observe the situation. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." Jack nodded, though the dispatcher couldn't see him. 5 minutes. It might as well have been an eternity. But at least he knew help was coming. He pocketed his phone and turned his attention back to the pair at the table. The man still seemed unaware that he was being watched, his demeanor calm, unhurried. But Jack knew better. He had seen men like him before, men who hid their intentions behind easy smiles and steady voices. Predators disguised as ordinary people. Jack had no doubt that the moment this man sensed danger, he would react, and that reaction could be unpredictable. Jack needed to be ready for anything. He took a slow step back, retreating toward the vending machines. He needed to keep watching without appearing obvious. From his new position, he could still see them clearly, every slight movement, every expression that passed across their faces. The girl kept her eyes down, barely moving except for the subtle signal she had given. The man, on the other hand, was beginning to show the first hints of nervousness. Then a sound cut through the tension like a knife. Faint at first, but growing louder, the wailing of police sirens in the distance. Jack's breath hitched. They were almost here. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the diner's windows, reflecting in distorted colors across the glass. Jack stole a glance toward the table and saw the man stiffen. His easy composure shattered in an instant. His eyes darted toward the door, then back at the girl, then at the door again. He was going to run. Jack tensed, every muscle in his body preparing to react. He knew that the moment the man moved, he would have to act fast. The girl was still within his reach, and if he panicked, he might try to take her with him. Then, just as Jack had predicted, the man shoved back his chair abruptly, reaching for his jacket with one hand and the girl's wrist with the other. Jack was already moving. He took a bold step forward, closing the distance between them just as the man started to stand. Leaving so soon. Jack's voice was casual but firm. He met the man's gaze unwavering. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the girl's wrist. "Yea," he said after a beat, forcing a smile. "We've got a long drive ahead of us." Jack didn't break eye contact. "That's so." The man swallowed. His eyes flicked once more toward the door, his mind clearly calculating his odds. Jack could see it, the internal battle playing out behind his eyes. Fight or flight. And then the door swung open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the diner, scanning the room. Jack let out a slow breath. Finally. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions." The man froze. His entire body tensed, and for a second Jack thought he might bolt. His grip on the girl tightened. Jack could see her trembling. One of the officers addressed her gently. "Miss, are you all right?" She didn't respond immediately. Jack could see the hesitation, the fear in her eyes. The weight of the moment. Then, barely above a whisper, she said the words that sealed the man's fate. "I need help." The man's expression shifted instantly, panic flashing across his face. He tried to pull her toward him, but before he could make another move, one of the officers grabbed his arm. "Sir, step away from the girl." The man struggled, his voice rising. "You don't understand." "I said step away." The officer's voice left no room for argument. After a tense moment, the man finally released the girl's wrist and raised his hands. Jack exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding. The officers moved swiftly. One kept the man restrained, while the other guided the girl away, speaking to her in a reassuring tone. Jack met her eyes one last time. There was still fear there, but also something else, relief. One of the officers turned to Jack. "You did the right thing calling this in." Jack nodded but didn't say anything. He hadn't done it for praise. He had done it because, in that moment, he had been the only one who could. As the officers led the man out in handcuffs, Jack watched him go, feeling the tension finally drain from his body. He glanced back at the girl, now safe in the care of the officers. Then, without another word, Jack turned and walked out of the diner, stepping into the cool night air. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to what had just unfolded. But Jack knew better. Tonight, a life had been saved. A female officer gently led the girl away from the noisy diner, guiding her to a quieter spot where they could talk in peace. The child's hands trembled, her eyes darting around as though expecting the man to reappear at any moment. The officer offered a small, reassuring smile, speaking in a soft, calm voice, trying to soothe the girl's frazzled nerves. Meanwhile, another officer sifted through the arrested man's documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but at least now the girl wasn't alone. Jack stood nearby, absorbing everything as his heart pounded against his ribs. Though the immediate chaos had begun to settle, he still felt the residual adrenaline in his veins. He exhaled slowly, trying to process the nightmarish situation unraveling before him. When one of the officers approached, clipboard in hand, Jack knew it was time to recount every detail of the harrowing event. With a steady yet weighted voice, Jack explained everything, from the moment he entered the diner to the instant the girl signaled for help. He spoke of the unnatural tension between the man and the child, the subtle cues that had made his gut twist uncomfortably. He explained how his military instincts told him something was wrong, even when he couldn't initially pinpoint why. The officer nodded attentively, jotting down notes as Jack spoke. At the same time, the young girl, still shaking, slowly opened up to the female officer. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but she spoke, spilling the truth in broken fragments. The man wasn't her father. He wasn't even a relative. He had taken her, kidnapped her right from school. And worse, it wasn't just some random abduction. The girl's mother, estranged from her for years after losing custody in court, had orchestrated the entire thing. The revelation sent a chill through the officer, prompting her to quickly relay the information to her colleagues. A deeper investigation confirmed the horrifying truth. The man, a known criminal, had no legal claim over the girl. He was her mother's new partner, and together they had meticulously planned the abduction. They had intended to take her far, perhaps out of state, maybe even out of the country. The thought made Jack's stomach churn. He clenched his fists, feeling an overwhelming surge of anger. If he hadn't intervened, if he had ignored his gut feeling, this little girl might have vanished forever. Moments later, the hum of a car engine signaled the arrival of another police vehicle. The back door flung open, and a middle-aged man stepped out hurriedly, his face a mixture of fear, anxiety, and desperation. His eyes frantically scanned the area until they landed on the small, fragile figure of his daughter. "Emma," he called out, his voice trembling, filled with worry and relief. The girl's head snapped up, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto her father's. The moment she saw him, a sob tore from her lips, and without hesitation, she bolted toward him. "Daddy," she cried, launching herself into his open arms. The man fell to his knees, pulling her into a crushing embrace, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His hands, rough and calloused, held her as though she might disappear again if he let go. Emma clung to him, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, her entire body racked with relieved tears. Jack watched the reunion from a few feet away, an unexpected lump forming in his throat. This moment, the sheer, raw emotion of it, was overwhelming. One of the officers approached Jack again, after the initial intensity of the reunion began to settle. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone sincere, "if you hadn't stepped in, I don't know what would have happened tonight. You saved a life." Jack nodded, his expression calm but contemplative. "I just did what needed to be done," he replied simply. He hadn't acted for recognition or praise. He had acted because a child had needed help, and he couldn't just walk away. Emma's father approached Jack next, his eyes still wet, his emotions barely contained. He reached out, grasping Jack's hand firmly. "I can't even begin to thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved my daughter. You saved my family." Jack gave a small, reassuring squeeze to the man's hand. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." But the father shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "Not everyone would have. You trusted your instincts, and that made all the difference." Jack didn't argue. He simply nodded. A few days later, Jack found himself standing outside Emma's home, having accepted an invitation he hadn't expected. The small gathering was warm, lively, filled with the comforting sounds of laughter and conversation. It was a stark contrast to the fear and chaos of the diner that night. When Jack entered the backyard, Emma's father greeted him with a wide smile. "You made it," he said, shaking Jack's hand firmly. "Come in, relax, your family now." Jack smiled, appreciating the warmth in the man's words. Not long after, a small figure came bounding toward him. Emma, now looking far more like the happy child she was meant to be, ran up with a bright, beaming smile. "Uncle Jack," she chirped. Jack blinked in surprise before a soft chuckle escaped him. He crouched down. "Hey there, Emma," he greeted. "You seem a lot happier now." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I am, thank you for helping me." Jack felt an odd warmth in his chest at her words. "I'm just glad you're safe." The party carried on with laughter, food, and an overwhelming sense of togetherness. Jack, initially feeling like an outsider, slowly found himself relaxing, accepting the unspoken invitation into this newfound bond. He watched Emma as she played with her cousins, her laughter ringing through the air like a melody of healing. She still had a journey ahead of her, but she had love, safety, and family. That was what mattered. As the evening drew to a close, Emma's father approached Jack, offering him a drink. He sighed, looking out at the sunset. "You know, Jack," he said, his voice filled with reflection, "that day at the diner, you didn't just save my daughter. You changed our lives." Jack exhaled, looking back at the family before him. Maybe he had. Maybe, in some small way, his decision to act had created a ripple effect, a moment that altered the course of a life for the better. Jack simply smiled, taking a sip from his drink and glancing at Emma, who was happily playing with the other children. "I didn't do it for gratitude. I just did what I thought was right." Emma's father nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of joy and deep gratitude. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, and not everyone has the courage to do it. Jack didn't respond. He simply watched the children play, understanding that some moments in life didn't require explanation or praise. What mattered most were actions. Sometimes the smallest actions could change a person's life forever. As the party wound down and the sun dipped behind the horizon, Jack prepared to leave. He waved goodbye to Emma and her father, knowing that he had formed a deeper connection than just being the man who saved a life. This journey had not just been about rescuing a child. It had been about creating a bond between strangers, all because of the courage to trust in what was right. Driving home, Jack felt an unfamiliar lightness in his heart. He had been through countless missions as a Marine, had seen war zones and faced danger head-on, but this experience was different. It was a reminder that battles aren't only fought on distant battlefields. Sometimes they happen right in front of us, in the everyday moments where we must choose between looking away or taking action. Jack reflected on the entire ordeal, from the moment he had walked into the diner to the moment Emma had been reunited with her father. It had all happened so quickly, leaving no time for doubt. His instincts had been his only guide, and he had acted without hesitation. If he hadn't, the outcome might have been very different. The empty road stretched ahead as Jack's thoughts continued to swirl. He realized how many lives could be changed by the seemingly small decisions people make every day. One moment of action, one choice to intervene, had prevented a tragedy and reunited a family. That realization filled him with a profound sense of peace. By the time Jack reached his house, the sky was a canvas of twinkling stars. He stepped out of his car, taking in the quiet serenity of the night. There was a peace within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in a while, he had found purpose beyond his past experiences in the military. He had always thought that courage meant charging into danger, but now he realized it also meant standing up for someone in need, even in the most ordinary of places. Jack entered his home, sat in his armchair, and felt a warmth settle over him. He had made the right decision, not just for Emma but for himself. It wasn't about heroism, it was about humanity. As he sat there, he understood something fundamental. True courage wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it would be easier to look the other way. That night, Jack slept soundly. He knew that his actions had left an imprint on Emma's life and her family's future. More importantly, he had discovered that even the smallest gestures of kindness and bravery could ripple outward, creating change in ways he hadn't imagined. In the weeks that followed, Jack resumed his quiet routine, though now something was different. Emma's father continued to call him, inviting him over for dinners and gatherings. What had started as a moment of crisis had evolved into an unexpected friendship. Jack, who had once kept to himself, found that he now had a place to go where he was truly welcomed. Each time Jack visited, Emma would run up to him with a bright smile, her eyes free of fear. Seeing her heal, watching her rediscover her innocence, brought Jack a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. Every small laugh, every moment of joy she shared, was a reminder that stepping in that day had been worth.